I want to start with this. Would it surprise you to know that women being trafficked in the United States are arrested and incarcerated at a higher rate than the traffickers and the consumers? Today, we will be discussing the high incarceration rates of sex trafficking workers in the United States. To have this conversation, we first must all understand the same definition of sex trafficking. According to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and its subsequent reauthorizations, define sex trafficking as a commercial sex act which is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So to have this conversation, we're going to be focusing on three primary points. First, why are survivors being incarcerated as opposed to provided services? Secondly, why are the incarceration rates so disproportionate for specific populations? And lastly, why are traffickers and consumers infrequently incarcerated? In conclusion, we will discuss why this is important to social workers and what you can do to help affect change. So to the first point, why are survivors being incarcerated as opposed to provided services? This has to do with something known in the United States as the prison pipeline. Historically, in the US, cycles of violence lead to a prison pipeline. This is because the prison pipeline is rooted in structural violence, which can be defined as any scenario in which a structure perpetuates inequity, thus causing preventable suffering. There's many examples of this in the history of the United States. For example, the war on drugs, which took an addiction issue and turned it into a criminalization issue. Segregation, which took keeping people with differing backgrounds and differing races separate from each other, resulted in riots, violence, and led people to prison. And going back to our country's inception, the entire idea of slavery. Slavery was a cycle of violence as well as its own prison in a way. So what does this all have to do with sex trafficking? Well, sex trafficking is another example of something that has gone from a cycle of violence to the prison pipeline. We find most oftentimes with sex trafficking survivors, they get stuck in a cycle. Oftentimes we find when survivors are imprisoned and they get released, they go back to the lifestyle. Why, you might wonder? Because they have no more resources than when they first entered. They're getting out of prison, they have nowhere to go, no food, no shelter, no support system. So they're going to go back to the only thing they know, thus creating this cycle of violence, which is going to continue to lead them to prison. Now, why does this happen? Oftentimes we find in arrests of sex trafficking survivors, the victim is blamed instead of listened to. They are then detained and they are then criminalized. There are a few common charges to see this happen on. The first is prostitution. We oftentimes find that sex trafficking survivors are being assumed to be prostitutes and therefore are arrested and incarcerated. This is especially true with our youth. Secondly, we see many sex trafficking survivors arrested and incarcerated on charges of theft. When their housing is unsure, their food sources are unsure, their clothing sources are unsure, if their trafficker gets mad at them, they hold all of the power and control and can cut all of those resources off. And then they're left to fend for themselves, oftentimes leading to theft. Violence is another very common charge for sex trafficking survivors to experience. Sometimes this is because they have caused violence to their sex traffickers to try to get away from them. Sometimes this is because they have caused violence to their consumers because the consumer wasn't willing to listen to their own limitations. They weren't willing to listen to the sex trafficked survivor say no, and therefore a violent situation ensued. Lastly, we oftentimes find drug-related charges with survivors of sex trafficking. And this is because we have found that the traffickers will sometimes use drugs as a way of getting them addicted, getting them in debt, and therefore keeping them in the cycle of trafficking. So now that we understand better why survivors are being incarcerated, I want to take a deeper dive into why the incarceration rates are so disproportionate for specific populations. When reviewing systemic cyclical issues of the United States, it is often impossible not to discuss inequities and inequalities across experiences based on identity. The three primary identities we're going to be focusing on today are age, race, and gender and/or sexual orientation. It's important to note with age that the average age at which girls first become victims of prostitution or sex trafficking is 12 to 14. And the average age for boys is 11 to 13. Why is this age so young, you might be wondering? Oftentimes, these are runaway youth or youth that have been kicked out of their home. So they have nowhere to go. They have no shelter. They have no food. They have no resources. And so traffickers find it easy to prey on them, get them indebted, provide them safety, maybe even start a relationship with them and identify themselves as their boyfriend or their caregiver. In addition to age, we find that race plays an integral role in incarceration rates. Nationally, the imprisonment rate for Black women is twice that of white women, even though that is not equivalent to the overall makeup of our society. We know that the criminal justice system is rooted in discrimination, race issues, so it shouldn't be a shock that the sex trafficking survivors being incarcerated are a higher rate of Black women or BIPOC identifying individuals. Through a 2-year review of all suspected human trafficking incidents across the country, 40% of sex trafficking victims were identified as Black women. This is an interesting statistic because it also shows us the higher rate at which Black women in general are being trafficked as compared to white women. According to the FBI, 57.5% of all juvenile prostitution arrests are Black children. And again, these prostitution arrests, more often than not, are actually sex trafficking survivors. However, they are being identified as prostitution and incarcerated. None of these statistics that I just shared with you are representative of our overall population makeup and just go to show how the victimization and the incarceration of our Black population is continuing to be disproportionate and based in racism and discrimination. Lastly, we find that gender and sexual orientation also plays a part or a role in your probability of being sex trafficked and therefore being incarcerated. We have to keep in mind with this one that it wasn't until 2003 that all heterosexual acts in the United States were fully discriminized. So this is also a population we're talking about that has a history of being persecuted, discriminated against, and entered into the criminal justice system. Across the country, nearly half of all LGBTQIA+ citizens are sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. Again, this is substantially higher than those heterosexual or cis-identifying individuals. Almost 1 in 5, 19%, report exchanging sex for money, food, or shelter. Now, when we're looking at these three pieces individually, age, race, and gender, it can be easy to just focus on one. However, we have to remember that there's an intersectionality. What if you have a child who identifies as a lesbian and is Black? Right there, they have not just one, but 3 identifying factors against them that raises the probability of them being sex trafficked, and then once trafficked, also raises the probability of them being incarcerated. Especially when so many of our youth today are coming out of the closet or coming into their full identity. We're finding that families are kicking these youth out on the street, not being supportive, so the youth are running away, which again is going to play into the age factor. So you can't really look at these individually, but instead have to take a holistic approach and look at the intersectionality of a human being's identity. This brings us to our last point. Why are traffickers and consumers so infrequently incarcerated? Similar to point 2, we're going to discuss race, socioeconomic ability, and power and control. Research conducted in 2012 showed that around 85% of those who bought sex on the internet were white men. Again, this is disproportionate to the overall makeup of the United States population. In an interview with the Urban Institute, traffickers admittedly believed that trafficking women would land them less jail time than trafficking white women if caught. So traffickers admittedly believe trafficking Black women would land them less jail time than trafficking white women if caught. So this can help explain why, first and foremost, traffickers are being incarcerated less frequently. They have figured out the imbalances of the criminal justice system and are able to play on that. And this also explains, as we were discussing earlier, why race is such a key factor in the incarceration rates of sex trafficking survivors. The second reason, socioeconomic ability. Oftentimes, the traffickers and the consumers are able to afford legal services. They can bail themselves out, they can get good representation, and therefore they can have whatever charges they're potentially being faced with expunged off of their record. This isn't true for the sex trafficking survivors. Oftentimes, the sex trafficking survivors have very limited resources, and out of fear or out of commitment to their traffickers, they are not going to give up their names. Lastly, we find that traffickers and consumers are infrequently incarcerated due to power and control. Oftentimes, when talking with sex trafficking survivors, they refer to their traffickers or their pimps as their boyfriends. It's not understood that that is what's going on. Also, we find that most traffickers and consumers are, again, of the Caucasian population, so they're not going to be targeted by the criminal justice system because the criminal justice system is rooted in racism. So now that we all understand all of this, how can social workers help? Why should this matter? Social workers right now are working to develop programs to intercept the incarceration of sex trafficking survivors. In Indiana, there's the Criminalization Alternative Project, which is a group of people working together to develop housing and programming so that sex trafficking survivors who are facing incarceration have an alternative place to go and program to participate in. We also need to work on policy development. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was created originally to help survivors of sex trafficking. However, like a lot of policy in the United States, we have found that this has come with significant backlash. And so it's important now that we develop new policy and further policy to reverse some of the unintended consequences that came of that act. Lastly, it is important to educate the public, especially our youth. They are at the most risk for becoming victims of sex trafficking. So it's important to educate them on what to look out for. It's important to educate them on what programs are out there. So if they do need help, we can provide them services. And it's important to educate them on the issues so that our next generation can continue this fight. Thank you so much.